in the gleaming heart of New York City, where skyscrapers reached toward the heavens and chaos moved with its own unique rhythm. Two lives from entirely different worlds were about to collide in a moment that would alter both forever. Maxwell Reed, a 45-year-old billionaire whose face regularly graced the covers of Forbes and the Wall Street Journal, emerged from the Lexington Hotel with the confident stride of a man accustomed to commanding rooms. His tailored charcoal gray suit fit impeccably, a subtle testament to the meticulous precision with which he lived his life. Salt and pepper hair slicked back neatly. The subtle glint of a gold Rolex peeked from beneath his sleeve as he reached into his inner jacket pocket. As Maxwell retrieved his sleek black leather wallet, his phone vibrated. Barely glancing at the notification, likely another reminder from his secretary about his upcoming shareholder meeting downtown, slid the phone back into his pocket. In that moment of distraction, the wallet slipped from his grasp, landing with an almost imperceptible thud on the polished pavement. Completely unaware of his loss, Maxwell continued toward his awaiting limousine, a sleek jet-black Rolls-Royce Phantom that gleamed under the fading sunlight. His longtime driver and personal assistant, James Miller, stood beside the open rear door. "Everything on schedule, sir?" James asked, his deep voice carrying the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent years anticipating his employer's needs. "As always," Maxwell replied, smoothing down his jacket as he prepared to slide into the plush leather interior. Across the street, amidst the blur of pedestrians, Lily Carter, a 10-year-old girl, sat on the cold, cracked concrete near the entrance of a subway station, her back pressed against a rusted metal railing. She had positioned herself just out of the way of foot traffic, where she remained visible enough for Samioni and Yodo drop a coin into the small paper cup before her. She had been there for hours, watching hundreds of polished shoes and designer heels pass by without slowing, without sparing a second glance at the little girl huddled in oversized clothes that barely clung to her frail frame. Her stomach rumbled with a dull, persistent ache she had grown accustomed to, but the real discomfort came from the deep itch in her skin, persistent reminder of the illness eating away at her body. The hoodie she wore, once a faded shade of pink, but now smudged with dirt, barely concealed the telltale signs of her condition. Her bald head, a result of the illness rather than a deliberate choice, gleamed slightly under the streetlights. Some people stared for a moment too long, their expressions unreadable: curiosity, discomfort, but no one ever stopped. Lily had long learned that people didn't like being reminded of things that made them uncomfortable. It was easier to ignore suffering than to acknowledge it. She had just begun to lose hope of collecting enough money for even a single meal, when she noticed something unusual: a black wallet, clearly expensive, lying unattended on the sidewalk. She blinked, her gaze darting from the wallet to the man who had unknowingly dropped it, a sharply dressed man. Stepping into a limousine, her heart pounded as she quickly scrambled to her feet, grabbing the wallet with nimble fingers. Lily had seen people drop things before, but she had never dared to intervene. Most would assume the worst of a street kid like her, but this time was different. She could see James closing the car door, about to seal the man inside. "Sir, wait," she called, her voice barely carrying over the noise of the city. When they didn't hear her, she ran, her worn-out sneakers slapping against the pavement as she weaved through pedestrians who barely noticed her presence. Her lungs burned, but she pushed forward, her eyes locked on the limousine, knowing she only had seconds before the car pulled away. Just as James placed his hand on the door handle to shut it completely, Lily lunged forward, reaching out and grabbing the edge of Maxwell's suit sleeve before immediately letting go. Realizing too late how improper that was, Maxwell turned sharply, mild irritation flashing in his piercing blue eyes. James instinctively took a step forward, placing himself between his employer and the ragged-looking child who had just dared to touch a billionaire's tailored sleeve. But before James could say anything, Lily thrust the wallet forward, her breathing heavy but determined. "You drop this," she said simply, her voice steady despite the way her hands trembled from exhaustion. For a moment, there was silence. Maxwell stared down at the wallet, then back at Lily, assessing her. Most people would have pocketed it, especially someone who clearly needed money as much as she did. A brief flicker of something surprises his features. Finally, he reached out and took the wallet from her small hands, his fingers brushing against hers for just a second. "Thank you," he said, his voice measured, as if the words felt unfamiliar in this context. Lily gave him a small nod, as if she hadn't expected anything more. She turned, already stepping back onto the curb, ready to return to her spot near the subway station. Maxwell had already begun to shift toward the car when a voice, sharp and full of irritation, cut through the air. "You again," a middle-aged man in a greasy apron, the logo of a nearby convenience store embroidered across his chest, stomped toward them. His face was twisted in frustration. His eyes locked onto Lily as if she were a stray animal that had wandered too close. "I told you to stop hanging around my store. You're scaring off my customers." Lily froze, shoulders tensing, her head instinctively dipping forward like she was bracing for impact. Maxwell, still standing by the open limousine door, slowly turned to the man, his expression unreadable. "Is she causing trouble?" he asked, his tone deceptively neutral. The store owner hesitated for half a second, clearly recognizing the high-profile businessman he had just snapped at. But his frustration outweighed his caution. "She doesn't steal anything, but she touches everything. Lingers around like she's waiting for the right moment to snatch something. It's bad for business." Maxwell's eyebrow lifted, the slight gesture exuding the confidence of a man who wasn't used to being challenged. "So she hasn't actually done anything wrong?" The man flushed, shifting on his feet. "Well, no, but..." Maxwell studied him for a long moment before letting out a small, almost amused breath. He glanced back at Lily, who still stood stiffly, her hands clenched into small fists at her sides. "Interesting," he murmured. Without another word, he turned, stepping into the limousine. James shut the door, the outside world muffling instantly as the car pulled away. Maxwell didn't immediately reach for his phone or his meeting notes. Instead, he leaned slightly toward the tinted window, watching Lily disappear into the crowd. Something about the encounter lingered in his mind. A child with nothing had just returned a wallet worth more than what she'd probably see in a year. And for some reason, he found himself noticing her in a way he never had before. Inside the climate-controlled silence of the limousine, Maxwell Reed sat with one leg crossed over the other, fingers idly tapping against the smooth leather of his wallet. The exchange with the girl played in his mind like a scene from a film brief, but unshakable, leaving behind an impression that refused to fade. He had encountered countless people in his life, from billionaires in tailored suits to politicians hungry for influence. Yet few had left him with a feeling quite like this. A street kid, homeless and clearly struggling, had not only returned his wallet, but had done so without hesitation, without expecting anything in return. That in itself was rare. James Miller, his driver and longtime assistant, had been with him long enough to sense the shift in his mood. From the rearview mirror, he observed the subtle furrow in Maxwell's brow, the way he remained uncharacteristically silent, his gaze drifting toward the cityscape as they weaved through traffic. James had worked for Maxwell for nearly 20 years, long enough to know that Reed was not an unkind man, but he was a pragmatist, a businessman first. If something didn't concern him, he didn't dwell on it. But this, James could tell that something about the encounter had unsettled him in a way Maxwell himself probably hadn't even processed yet. Adjusting his tie, James cleared his throat. "That was unexpected," he said, his voice measured. "Most kids in her position would have kept the wallet." Maxwell didn't respond immediately. He turned his attention to the window, watching the crowded sidewalks blur past. After a moment, he exhaled through his nose, a thoughtful sound rather than a dismissal. "She didn't even think twice," he murmured, more to himself than to James. "Just ran after me like it was the only option." James nodded slightly. Some people, even when they have nothing, still choose to do the right thing. Maxwell considered that, his fingers still absently brushing against the edge of his wallet. His mind flickered back to the store owner's words. The way the man had spoken about her as if her mere existence outside his store was a crime. It wasn't the first time Maxwell had seen that kind of dismissive hostility. People feared what made them uncomfortable, what reminded them that life wasn't as balanced as they'd like to believe. He shifted slightly in his seat. "Slow down, James." James, though slightly surprised, obeyed without question, easing his grip on the steering wheel as the limousine's speed decreased. "Something wrong, sir?" Maxwell scanned the streets as the car rolled forward at a more deliberate pace, his sharp gaze flicking through the sea of pedestrians. "See if you can spot her." James's brows lifted slightly, but he didn't question the request. Instead, he adjusted the rearview mirror, glancing out at the passing sidewalks. They both searched, eyes moving through the faces of hurried professionals, tourists clutching shopping bags, street vendors shouting over the city noise. Then, their familiar small figure hunched against the cold brick wall of another convenience store. Block down. The girl. She was sitting on the sidewalk, her knees pulled close to her chest, her paper cup still in front of her, though it remained nearly empty. Unlike before, her head wasn't turned toward passing pedestrians in silent hope. Instead, she was staring at her hands, fingers tracing over her thin wrists as if trying to warm them. Maxwell observed her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Pull over." James hesitated only for a fraction of a second before easing the car toward the curb, bringing the limousine to a smooth stop just ahead of where the girl sat. Maxwell reached for the door handle, pausing only briefly before stepping out onto the pavement. His polished Oxford shoes met the cracked concrete with a quiet but definitive sound, one that made the girl's head snap up. She recognized him immediately, her dark eyes widening slightly, though whether in surprise, confusion, or caution, Maxwell couldn't tell. He crouched to her level, taking care to keep his movements measured, unthreatening. The city noise continued around them, but in that moment, the world seemed to shrink between just the two of them. "Hello again," he said, his tone calm but intent. The girl's gaze flickered to the limousine behind him, then back to Maxwell, her instinct screaming that this was out of the ordinary. Men like him in inexpensive suits, stepping out of cars, worth more than a lifetime of meals, didn't come back. They didn't stop twice. "Did I forget something?" she asked carefully. Maxwell almost smiled at that. The way her immediate thought was that she must have made a mistake, that the only reason he'd returned was because he needed something from her. "No," he said simply, "but I think I might have." Her brows were upon, confusion flickering across her features. Maxwell didn't immediately elaborate. Instead, he reached into his wallet, same one she had returned to him just minutes ago. He withdrew several crisp $100 bills and placed them in the cup in front of her. The girl froze, staring at the money as if she wasn't sure whether it was real. She swallowed. Don't. It's not charity," Maxwell interrupted smoothly. "It's for a meal. Maybe something warm to wear." She hesitated, clearly fighting some internal battle. Eventually, she looked away, her fingers curling slightly round the edge of the cup. "Thank you," she murmured, though the words sounded both grateful and wary. Maxwell studied her for a moment longer. Then, in a voice quieter, more deliberate, he asked, "What's your name?" The girl blinked, surprised by the question. For a moment, she hesitated, as if debating whether to answer. "Lily," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Maxwell nodded slightly, committing the name to memory. "Lily," he repeated, testing the sound of it. Then, with quiet intent, he asked, "What do you really need?" Her head snapped back up, her eyes locking onto his. Maxwell hadn't meant for the question to carry weight, but somehow it did, because for the first time since they had crossed paths, Lily's carefully constructed walls wavered. She was still a child, still young enough to wish for things, but old enough to understand how cruel the world could be. Her small hands clenched around the fabric of her hoodie, as if holding herself together. "I need help," she whispered. There was something raw about the way she said it, something that made Maxwell sit back slightly, something that told him this wasn't about the money. Before he could press further, before he could fully piece together the weight of her words, the moment was shattered. A new noise cut through the usual city chowshouts, not from Lily, not from Maxwell, but from passers-by, their voices tinged with curiosity, surprise. Maxwell turned his head just in time to see a small crowd forming just a few feet away. It had taken people longer than usual to recognize him, but now that they had, the reaction was immediate. "Maxwell Reed," someone gasped, already pulling out a phone. "Oh my God, is that him?" A ripple effect spread through the crowd as more people took notice. Some whispered, some pointed, some outright approached, and in the middle of it all, Lily shrank back, her body tensing instinctively as the small space between them and the world began to close in. Maxwell saw the moment panic flickered across her face. Without hesitation, he made a split-second decision. "Lily," he said, his voice firm but quiet. She looked up at him, fear creeping into her expression, her fight-or-flight instincts kicking in hard. "Come with me," Maxwell said. He didn't wait for her to answer. He simply extended his hand, a silent offer, an unspoken promise. And for the briefest second, Lily hesitated. Then, before she could think better of it, she grabbed his hand. And just like that, everything changed. Maxwell didn't waste another second. With the crowd pressing closer, their voices a growing murmur of excitement and speculation, he turned smoothly, guiding Lily toward the waiting limousine. James, ever observant, had already stepped forward, positioning himself like a barrier between them and the eager onlookers. "Excuse us, folks." James's voice was calm but firm, a subtle authority woven into his words as he raised a hand, blocking a woman who had nearly shoved her phone into Maxwell's face. "Let's give Mr. Reed some space." The cameras didn't stop flashing. Someone called out a question, something about whether this was some kind of PR stunt, whether the billionaire had adopted a homeless kid, but Maxwell ignored them, his grip on Lily's hand remaining steady, his pace brisk but measured, his mind already calculating the best course of action. The limousine door swung shut behind them, sealing out the murmurs of the growing crowd, the flashing lights of lifted phone cameras, and the restless energy of the city beyond. Inside, the world felt suddenly smaller, quieter, but not calm. Lily sat stiffly against the plush leather seat, her small frame visibly tense. Her fingers curled into the worn fabric of her hoodie as if bracing for something. The contrast between her and her surroundings was stark. A girl whose entire existence had been shaped by survival, now enclosed in an environment built for opulence, comfort, control. Maxwell watched her carefully, noting the way her breath came to fast, to shallow, the way she barely met his gaze despite how boldly she had grabbed his hand just moments ago. He didn't speak yet. He had learned through years of business negotiations that sometimes silence was more telling than words. James, his ever-efficient driver, didn't ask where they were going. He merely pulled away from the curb, maneuvering through the streets with his usual calm precision, waiting for instruction. But Maxwell wasn't thinking about a destination just yet. He was watching Lily, the way her shoulders hunched inward, the way her hands trembled despite her attempt to keep them still, the way sweat dotted her forehead despite the controlled coolness of the limousine's interior. Something wasn't right. "Lily," he said, his voice steady but firm, testing how she responded to her own name. She didn't answer. Her breathing quickened. "Lily," he tried again, this time leaning slightly forward. Her small chest rose and fell erratically, her dark eyes suddenly losing focus, her grip loosening from her hoodie. Then, without warning, her body slumped sideways. Maxwell moved instantly, catching her before she could slide onto the floor. "Lily," his voice, usually measured and composed, was now sharp, edged with an urgency that startled even himself. He pressed his palm to her forehead, to Hotha's other hand shaking her shoulders slightly, trying to rouse her. Nothing. James's gaze flicked to the rearview mirror. "Sir, she's unconscious," Maxwell said, his mind already shifting into action. "Take us to a hospital. Now." James didn't hesitate. The car lurched forward, weaving through lanes of traffic with a controlled urgency that only years of disciplined driving could achieve. Maxwell barely noticed. His focus was on the fragile girl in his arms, her breathing shallow, her body unnervingly light. This wasn't just exhaustion. This wasn't just hunger. Something was deeply wrong. The moment the limousine screeched to a halt outside the emergency entrance, Maxwell was already out the door, carrying Lily in his arms. The sight of a billionaire in a tailored suit cradling a frail, unconscious girl sent a ripple of confused urgency through the hospital staff. "I need a doctor," Maxwell said, his voice like steel, brooking no delay. A team of nurses rushed forward, a gurney appearing in seconds. What happened? One of them asked as they transferred Lily from his arms onto the bed. She collapsed in the car, Maxwell said. She was breathing fast before she lost consciousness. Something's wrong. The nurse nodded sharply. We'll take it from here, sir. Maxwell moved to follow, but another nurse-older, firm, used a handling high-profile situation step between him and the rolling gurney. You need to wait here. For the first time in years, Maxwell felt helpless. He watched as they wheeled Lily down the corridor, disappearing behind the double doors marked emergency treatment, authorized personnel only. A strange, unfamiliar feeling settled in his chest await. A knot, something unshakable and uneasy. James approached from the entrance, his expression unreadable. Sir, Maxwell exhaled, forcing himself to focus. Stay here. If anyone asks, tell them I'll cover all expenses. I don't care how much it costs, just make sure she gets whatever she needs. James gave a curt nod. Understood. And so Maxwell waited. Minutes stretched into an hour. The rhythmic beep of machines, the distant murmur of medical staff, the antiseptic smell of the hospital, everything around him blurred into irrelevance. He had never been a man who waited for answers. He was used to demanding them, creating them, controlling them. But here, in this moment, there was nothing he could do but wait. Then, at last, a doctor appeared, a clipboard in hand, his face marked with fatigue but professionalism. Mr. Reed. Maxwell straightened immediately, every muscle in his body coiled with anticipation. How is she? The doctor sighed, measuring his words carefully. She's stable for now, but she's severely malnourished, dehydrated, and her body is dangerously weak. He hesitated, then added, more concerningly, she has advanced stage cancer. Maxwell felt something shift inside him, something cold and unfamiliar curling in his chest. The doctor continued, flipping through the chart. Stage 3 malignant melanoma, from what we can determine so far. She likely hasn't received consistent treatment, if any at all. He shook his head. Her immune system is compromised, which makes even minor infections a serious threat. We'll need to run more tests, but she's in a critical state. Maxwell processed this in silence. Lily wasn't just a hungry child on the street. She was dying. The realization settled like stone in his stomach. Can I see her? His voice was quiet but firm. The doctor nodded. She's conscious now, but she's weak. Try not to overwhelm her. Maxwell exhaled slowly, then steeled himself, and then he stepped into the hospital room. Lily lay small and fragile against the stark white sheets, and for in her arm. Her skin still far too pale. But when she saw him, her dark eyes sharpened, watchful, uncertain. Maxwell pulled up a chair beside her bed, studying her for a moment before speaking. How do you feel? Lily gave a half shrug, as if the question barely mattered. I've been worse. Maxwell exhaled through his nose, something almost like dry amusement. That's not exactly reassuring. She didn't answer. Silence stretched between them. Then Maxwell asked, where do you live? For the first time, Lily hesitated. Then quietly she murmured, a shelter. A group home. Maxwell tilted his head slightly, his sharp mind already putting the pieces together. An orphanage? Lily nodded, her fingers fidgeting with the thin hospital blanket. Hope Haven. It's not bad, but they don't have a lot. The medicine I need, the hospital visits. She trailed off, shrugging again, as if that was just the way things were. Maxwell didn't speak right away. Instead, he considered what to do next. Finally, he said, take me there. Lily's gaze snapped to his, startled. Why? Because, Maxwell said simply, I think I need to see where you come from. For a long moment, Lily just stared at him, as if trying to decide if he was serious. Then, finally, she gave a small nod. And just like that, the course of Maxwell Reed's life changed forever. The rain had started by the time they reached Hope Haven. It wasn't a heavy downpour, just a soft, persistent drizzle. The kind that made the air thick with the scent of damp pavement and old brick. The limousine rolled to a stop in front of the weathered building. Its once white exterior now faded to a dull gray, the paint chipping in places. The windows, some of them cracked, glowed faintly with the dim light from inside. The sign above the entrance, Hope Haven Orphanage, was crooked, the lettering barely legible beneath years of grime and neglect. Maxwell Reed sat in the back seat, watching as Lily shifted beside him, staring at the building with an expression he couldn't quite place. Relief? Embarrassment? Maybe both. He had seen a lot of things in his life: hostile boardrooms, desperate entrepreneurs, cities built and destroyed by the weight of money and ambition. But he had never seen anything quite like this. He stepped out first, opening an umbrella, then turned to Lily. She hesitated, glancing at the umbrella before looking up at him. Her instinct was to refuse, to insist she didn't need it, but after a brief pause, she moved closer, standing beside him as they walked toward the entrance. The moment the door swung open, a voice rang out, warm, familiar, filled with both relief and exasperation. Lily Carter, a woman in her early 60s, stood in the doorway, her graying hair pulled into a loose bun, her round glasses slipping slightly down the bridge of her nose. She was small in stature, but carried herself with a quiet authority, the kind earned through years of caring for children who had no one else. Maxwell watched as Lily shrank slightly, guilt flashing across her face. "Hi, Miss Sarah." Sarah Bennett let out a heavy breath, closing the distance between them in 3 quick strides, her hands immediately reaching for Lily's face, brushing damp strands of hair away, checking her over like a mother would a child who had been missing for days. "Where have you been?" Sarah demanded, though her voice trembled with concern more than anger. "We've been looking everywhere. You can't just disappear like that. Do you have any idea how worried I was?" Lily winced but didn't pull away. "It was okay, I swear. I just needed to." She hesitated, then turned slightly, as if suddenly remembering Maxwell was standing there. Sarah followed her gaze, her expression shifting from concern to confusion as her eyes landed on the well-dressed man, standing in the entryway, an expensive umbrella in hand. His presence so out of place it might as well have been a mirage. Maxwell offered a polite nod. "Maxwell Reed." Sarah's brow furrowed. "The Maxwell Reed?" Maxwell wasn't sure if the way she said it was good or bad. Sarah blinked, shaking her head as if trying to process the absurdity of the situation. She started, then turned back to Lily, searching her face for an explanation. Lily shifted on her feet. "He helped me." Sarah's lips parted, but whatever questions she had, she didn't ask them. Not yet. Instead, she stepped back, holding the door open. "Come inside. It's cold." The interior was small, cramped, but clean. The walls were lined with shelves of donated books, the furniture was mismatched, and the air carried the faint scent of something baking, probably. Sarah's way of making the place feel more like home. A group of children peeked from the hallway, their curious faces partially hidden behind the doorframe. Lily offered a small wave, and almost immediately, a little boy, no older than 6, darted from the group, throwing himself at her. "Lily, you're back." Lily staggered slightly, but caught him, laughing softly as she ruffled his hair. "Miss me, Noah?" The boy nodded fervently, clinging to her hoodie. "I thought you got lost." Maxwell watched the interaction, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. Sarah, still standing near the doorway, finally turned to him. "Would you like some tea, Mr. Reed?" Maxwell hadn't planned to stay long, but for some reason, he said, "Yes." The kitchen was small, but well kept, the table scratched and worn, the chairs slightly uneven. Sarah set to mismatched mugs on the table, pouring the tea with steady hands. Maxwell studied her, noting the dark circles beneath her eyes, the way her movements held the kind of exhaustion that came from years of fighting battles. No one noticed. "I don't mean to sound ungrateful," Sarah began, wrapping her fingers around her mug. "But what exactly is a billionaire doing in my kitchen?" Maxwell took a sip of his tea, the warmth grounding him. "I met Lily today," he said simply. Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line. "She's a good kid, too stubborn for her own good sometimes." She hesitated, then sighed. "Did she tell you about her condition?" Maxwell nodded. "Stage 3. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, exhaling. "We've done everything we can, but treatment, it's expensive. And this place," she gestured around them, "it barely runs as it is." Maxwell glanced around again, this time seeing it different: lithe, peeling paint, the lack of proper heating, the worn-out shoes on the children's feet. "This place," he said slowly, weighing his words, "shouldn't have to fight this hard to exist." Sarah looked at him, a flicker of something hope. Skepticism in her gaze. That's the world, mister. Read. Maxwell set his mug down. Then maybe the world needs to change. Silence. Lily, who had been sitting quietly nearby, lifted her head. You mean it? Maxwell met her gaze. Yes, and he did. The following weeks were a blur of movement, plans, action. Maxwell didn't just write a check, he rebuilt Hope Haven from the ground up. A full renovation, proper medical care, new beds, new books, a full pantry. And not just for Lily, but for every child in that orphanage. Every child like her who had been told that survival was the best they could hope for. Lily's treatment began immediate, telleth best doctors, the best care. No more begging, no more waiting. And yet, even through it all, Maxwell kept coming back not as a benefactor, but as a friend. The rain had stopped. A quiet evening settled over Hope Haven, the air carrying the scent of fresh bread and newly polished wood. The once dilapidated orphanage now stood strong, filled with laughter, warmth, and something that hadn't existed there before, security. Inside, in a corner of the common room, Maxwell Reed sat in an oversized chair, a book open in his lap. Beside him, curled up in a blanket, Lily leaned against his side, her eyes half-lidded as she listened to his voice. And so the traveler set forth, not knowing what awaited him, but certain that whatever lay ahead, he would face it without fear. Maxwell glanced down. Lily had fallen asleep, the smallest of smiles on her lips. He closed the book, exhaling softly. For the first time in his life, his wealth had done more than build empires. It had built a home. And somehow, that mattered more than anything. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey through the chance encounter. That changed everything. Stories like Maxwell and Lily's remind us that sometimes the most profound connections emerge from the briefest moments. A dropped wallet, an act of honesty, a decision to see beyond appearances. At Tales of the Heart, we believe in the power of stories to inspire compassion, challenge perspectives, and remind us of our shared humanity. Every week, we bring you carefully crafted narratives that explore the depth of human connection, the resilience of the human spirit, and the transformative power of kindness. Join our community today by subscribing to Tales of the Heart. Hit the subscribe button and activate the notification bell to ensure you never miss a story that might just change the way you see the world. With each new tale, we hope to touch your heart, spark meaningful conversations, and perhaps even inspire you to create ripples of kindness in your own life. Because in a world that often feels divided, stories remind us of what we share: our hopes, our struggles, our capacity for compassion, and our ability to transform lives through simple acts of kindness. Tales of the Heart, where every story matters and every heart counts.